This is a beautiful landscape shot of the Rototuna suburb in Hamilton. I come from Ngaruawahia, so I drive past this, have been driving past scenes like this for the last few years. And the background to this piece, if we could just move to the next slide, is that I produced a report. Why haven't we got the clicker here? Here we are. I wrote a report entitled, this is a sort of year, 18 months ago, Are We Building Harder, Hotter Cities? And it was really just asking what has happened. It's just purely empirical. This is not sort of opinion stuff. What has happened to Auckland, Hamilton and Wellington between the 1940s and today? And what it shows is that public green space is being squeezed, but it's still there. Private green space is absolutely shrinking. The result of densification and a whole lot of things is that we're building cities where you've got much more impermeable surfaces, which both mean that water running off is going faster and into your stormwater systems or into whatever. And of course, you're producing a town which is blacker in many cases, and it's absorbing energy. And so you've got a real heat issue. And with climate change coming, so we saw what happened in Auckland on the water side. So I think New Zealand is sort of sensitised to that one, but there's also the heat issue. That little diagram there, which was from, was in the first report, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there you are. If you've got 55% impervious, 45% green space, then that as the water yield, what have we got? I haven't got the metric, but the point is that you increase the impervious surface, reduce the amount of green space, and the yield of water is very, very significant. So you really are putting a lot more pressure on your systems.
I think it's around a 25% increase, if I'm not mistaken.
It's 25% increase, yeah. So the report is worth reading if you haven't read it. Nobody has ever done this work. It was the first time it's been done. But talking to people in cities, they recognise the problem. And I suppose in that report we were saying, you need to think about the amount of green space. This is quite cheap infrastructure compared with concrete pipes and stuff. So you really need to have this. And some cities are doing this, and they're doing this quite well. The one bit that I couldn't get into in that first report was what's happening to the soil. Because we became aware, can we go to the next slide? Yeah.
There is, that one's probably the best.
Yeah, that's probably it. Well, let me just show you there. I'll just go back. The associated benefits. So you got air filtering, biodiversity, shading, cooling, all the rest of it, and then different types of green space ranging from lawns to low shrubs to wetlands to trees. This is as crude as hell. But you're not getting a lot of benefit from lawns on some things. Low shrubs, you're getting some. It's trees that provide most of the benefit. Trees are really good. Canopy trees slow the rate of water getting through. They also provide shade. So that's what I realised is that we'd done an awful lot on impermeable surfaces and things, but we hadn't looked at soil. And of course, it's the soil which supports all of that green, whether it's lawns through to trees. And if you think of that first picture I put up, and I see this everywhere, all around New Zealand, just massive gear stripping the topsoil, piles of it. Some of it goes off-site. A lot of it gets dumped because, they say it's contaminated. Now, there's a real issue around how much of it really is contaminated. But then it's all these flat platforms. So you're building cities now, flat platform, tannalised pine, retaining wall, platform. Now, commercially, that's great. It increases the yield. But what you've done in the process is completely compacted the subsoil. And so when people they produce these promotional things, shows old people sitting park benches, trees, houses, it looks wonderful. But of course, in some of these places, a tree will never grow because you've so compacted the subsoil that you're going, and we're up my way, where it is hard old clays, you're just creating something almost like concrete for So you can grow grass. They put a nice couche of grass, a nice layer of grass, but it's never going to grow much. And I think trees are actually pretty important in terms of climate moderation, in terms of the rain and the heat. So Bella led a review which tried to find out what was happening and why this is the case. And if you look at the report, and Bella can answer questions in detail, what we discovered is there's no single reason why all of this is happening, but there are a number of things going on. Some of them have obviously got to do with just straight commercial stuff. Land's expensive, you want to cover as much of it in housing as you can. So there's a good commercial reason there. But there's also reasons of a sort of a geotechnical nature which go back to building. And you'd be aware now that, or maybe not, 90% of houses in New Zealand are built on concrete pad foundations. That's just the industry standard. You've got a builder, that's what they know how to do. In fact, I've got a builder doing some work for me at present, and I said to him, no one's building piles. I said, have you heard of screw piles, which is a new piling technique? Oh, he said, yeah, I have. We don't know anything about it, really. This is what we do. And there's a lot of past dependency around what people know how to do. And, of course, the regulations back them up because you do all of the work and you've got your building standards, your geotech stuff says, OK, if you've taken all the soil off, you get down to good ground, then you can use concrete and you do the following and it's just tick the boxes. And so you get a sort of a one-way street which takes you in the direction of taking everything down. Now, I see Dr. Campbell's from Christchurch, and it's not the same for you because you're on these alluvial and moraine outwash things. So this is a particular problem in some places. It'll be different in others. But of course, if you think about it, if you are building on piles, you haven't done all of that compaction. Water can flow underneath in an extreme event. It's a very, very different physical environment. We discover who's responsible for soil in this country? Well, it's regional councils. But guess what? Regional councils don't actually take much notice of urban soil. They review their role historically as being about erosion. So it's erosion control. So there's actually not much regional council oversight on what's happening to subsoil for trees. Now, look, you can ask questions. I'll stop here, and Bella is the best person to answer them. But I'll say this, because we've got some recommendations in here, which you'll have noticed. And, you always have to come up with some recommendations. But I'll tell you, having thought about this, and I've talked to a few conferences, talked to lots of people. And by the way, we talked to developers, we talked to councils, and we've talked to a large number of people. We're reasonably confident we've got the problem thing taped. If I was the government, I think I'd get the ministry to just get a workshop together, get some of the best developers in New Zealand, get some of the best regional councils who are dealing with these problems, get some of the geotech and building standards people, and say, look, do we need to do to soil what we're doing? Are there ways you could do things differently? And I really think that just bringing the parties together to have a conversation about it would be a very good place to start. You could start trying to regulate for these things, but I think the government needs to find out more about what's going on. But my concern is this: if we stay on the track we are, and the city that I live near is not going to be able to grow anything more than about this high in large areas. It's going to be a harder and hotter city, and what's happened to the soil is one of the reasons. Now, you asked some questions, and I'm going to defer to Bella, who's the expert.
Just a really quick one.
Sure.
You just said there that you think the minister should get people in the room. Which minister?
Oh, sorry. I think the Minister for the Environment is responsible for the RMA. I think the MFE, basically, if I was MFE and I had a report like this, I'd actually workshop it and say, right, has he got it right? Has he got it wrong? And try, but you need the developers. These are the people who know really what happens on the ground. And there are some very good developers wanting to do things differently, and it's not always easy for them.
But would you involve building as well?
Yes. This is the thing. It's a bit like the last talk. You've got to get all the bits together. You've got the Building Act people, the geotech people, there's the consultants, there's the developers, there's the earth movers and all the rest of it, and then there's the regional councils, because they don't see themselves as being heavily involved here. The regional councils as well.
I think that just before we go to you, Hamish, the biggest challenge is convincing the powers that be of the why.
Yep.
Why is this important? type thing. And this report goes some way to actually starting that conversation off.
It's heat and flooding,
Right.
the two.
Hamish.
Can we go back to the slide where you had kind of like intensification house? There was, you had a small house on the left and a
The ramp.
ramp, because that's not in our readings.
Sorry, you go back?
And can you do, I suppose the question is, we're looking at kind of, I suppose, urban sprawl versus.
No, that one.
No.
That one.
Yep.
Is that the one you meant?
Yes, over intensification. So,
The next one up.
no.
Is
that the one you wanted?
Yeah, because that's not in the report.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't. You're right.
So can you just, are you trying in this figure here, are you trying to argue that actually a more
Trees. That's what it says.
intense housing, if we go up higher, we're actually doing a better job because we're going to have a lot of trees and we're utilising our land better? Or are you saying that kind of as you come down to your suburban sprawl, that actually those properties would in effect have more green space and less compaction?
I think the key point is as the amount of green space in the cities shrink, particularly through intensification, the small amount that you have left has to do a lot more heavy lifting, and you need it to be able to be a higher quality of green space. So if all you're able to do in that smaller plot of green that's left is plant a lawn, it's going to get hotter. You're going to increase your stormwater runoffs. If you've designed that so that small amount can have trees and other things, you're going to really reduce the amount of heating. You're going to manage your stormwater better, and it's about really thinking if you're going to have less green space, you've got to have it so it creates more functions and more ecosystem services. You've got to think about it a lot more. It's a little, if you are sort of got the low rise, big backyards, you might not have to plan that as well. But actually the evidence we found in the building hotter cities is actually all we're doing is having smaller sections and bigger houses. It's not more intense, it's just less green space anyway.
I suppose I was talking about intense.
Just please, we're working right through. We're not having to.
That's right. No, I'm fine, thanks.
And
I'll be
sort
right.
of a clarification on that point, that is that this report's in the context of those other reports.
Yes, it is. This is a little pendant. It's a little off to one side.
So I might encourage you, Matt, to just talk it, although you've just been handed a muffin, sorry, to talk a bit more about what those other reports have done as well, because it's a new select committee since you did that.
Well, that's the Harder, Hotter Cities report. Yeah, well, I mean, what that showed, which I thought I just outlined it briefly, but I encourage new members to actually read it. It's actually really, really interesting. But what we did is we used, it isn't really AI, but we used some clever techniques to try to analyse changes in aerial photography using the same plots across cities. And what they showed, as Matt mentioned, is that we're getting densification is causing smaller sections, but the houses have grown. The houses have grown very significantly in size, so they're growing towards the boundary. And then, of course, by the time you take in driveways and pavements and this, that, and the other thing, you're down to very low levels in some cases. Now, the MDRS has a 20%. Am I correct?
I think so.
20% is the green space that's minimum. That is actually below what you have already in some parts. It's actually we're on a course which would actually take you even further. Now, my feeling is that if you want to do that, fine. But as Matt says, you then need to start looking at what you've got left that you can green. Now, streets, berms are a huge area. I mean, the streets can be up to 20% of the area of a city. And yes, obviously you're going to have the asphalt and the pavements, but the trees that you plant can make a big difference. Now, of course, you've got services, so that's complicated because you've got wires and things. Now, the cheapest thing will always be not to plant any trees and just to run everything through. But there are techniques available for enabling tree roots to go down and not disturb stuff. But again, if you have simply flatten the subsoil to the point nothing will grow, you won't be able to grow very big trees. So you need to think about it from the beginning. You need to internalise this from the start.
Just before we go to Katie, I was just going to ask that 20%, what was the science behind that particular figure?
I don't know what the science was.
Sorry,
This is the 20%, the MDRS.
what was I didn't hear the question though,
I'm
sorry.
wondering how did they pick that as a figure? Like, what was the science behind it?
Don't know.
Yeah, I couldn't.
Ask
get to the bottom
MFE.
Of that,
Yeah.
so I did try to find that out at one point, but it wasn't entirely clear.
Yeah.
If I might
Yeah.
just add a little bit, I
Yeah.
think on
Do.
Hamish Campbell's question. One of the things that we really found is obviously the MDRS particularly is there's this really big drive towards the townhouse mode modality of building. And that once you account for, it's not only the platform of the building itself that is a driver for the soil stripping, it's also all of the other hard infrastructure around it. So it's the roading, each of those will have its own geotechnical stability requirements. And so what you end up left with, or the developer gets left with, is a patchwork of small pieces of soil. So it really doesn't seem worthwhile to selectively excavate the footprint of either the building or the roads when you've got such small patches left behind. That's partly why a lot of it gets stripped. But from what I understand, from what we've learned from Harder, Hotter Cities work, was that it's not a zero-sum game. You don't have to have either housing or green space, but it's kind of if you do go up, like maybe you can fit more housing in plus have a bigger green space, or it's thinking about the developer thinking about the we are making a townhouse development here, so what is happening in another part of that neighbourhood, or where are the kind of high functioning patches of green space that are going to provide the the soakage in a heavy rain event, or the provision of trees. So that's the way we kind of came to look at it.
And if you want to just round this out, going back to the Harder, Hotter Cities report, one of the things we noticed was that if you were going to be providing green space in the future, you really need to look at the way councils go about it, because currently they tie their hands behind their back. They approve a zoning change, huge capital gain for the guy selling the land, and then they sell it on sale to the developer. And the developer wants to maximise yield because they paid a fortune for it. And, we're going to have parks and reserves. Oh, yes. And then the fight starts to make those absolutely as small as possible. Whereas if councils, and some have done this very well, Wellington is one, Hamilton's done this too in some places, have gone out strategically and bought land in advance before there's any zoning change, you can secure green space. And that's what they did 100 years ago. Of course, land was cheaper, but we're not providing those green lungs, if you like, because then if you've got a big green space, you can be like Central Park in New York, you can have 40, 50 stories around it, but they've got a lot of green space. Whereas what we're doing is going for sort of slightly dense, a lot of concrete in asphalt, roads, and nothing green at all. I mean, I'm all for dense, but you can do dense in a way. If you do dense, you need green as well.
Okay, Katie.
I have a number of points and questions, but I'll start sort of in the beginning. Firstly, just to comment, Simon, on your most recent point. I mean, I think the issue is a lack of sort of regional understanding, or the kind of number one issue we have across the board, whether it's with car parking spaces or transport changes or, green space, is the willingness of the community and, the need for local governors to be re-elected. Because of course, in my area, that's one of the most contentious, not the single most contentious, in terms of urban density.
Yeah.
And so of course, greenfield development always is the one thing people want, because they want to maintain that big section size and still have their little bit of outdoor living and whatnot. So that's sort of, yes, my observation. That's a really hard attitude thing to change, although we're enabling it. I think the question I've got is around the complexities of the geotechnical aspect of foundations. And I know, riprap and screw piles, thank you. I'm seeing development near my parents' place where I grew up at the moment, and it is really just scraping the whole thing.
Yep.
However,
in similar areas, there is a real difference in some soils from like really clay, hard, like nothing's really going to grow on it. And in my lifetime, it's really just been sort of dry, patchy grass, weeds, the odd scraggly pine tree, you know, quite average soil in the best of times. Then in some areas quite nearby, you've got beautiful, very good, high grade, fertile soil. Of course, there's land use classes that protect that anyway. You know, so I know that there's so many complexities to it, but at the same time, I guess I suppose I want your thoughts on how do you marry up the geotechnical side of things where you need that firm soil in terms of slipping, you know, sinking, whatever you want to say, and then at the same time in terms of the soil that can even be saved anyway.
I mean, spatial planning is at the high level, one of the ways you deal with that. I mean, your councils will know a lot about all of this. I'd say that it's really in the areas where you don't need to use, you don't need good ground because you could have used piles, but the industry practice is just to use it anyhow, that people should be asking some questions. I mean, as I understand it, you know, these people want concrete pad. Why? Because the section, it's what's the phrase? It's build
ready.
ready. Yeah, people want build ready. If you say, here's a plot, and they say, is it build ready? Well, no, but you'd have to get somebody in to do the geotech. Oh, we're not interested in that. So from a developer's point of view, you can just say, here it is, turnkey, the clay's there, it's all compacted, the builders can move in tomorrow. That's what the market's after. But when I think of, Bella lives in Brooklyn, and I think of the way they built Brooklyn 100 years ago, there's no concrete in sight, it's all on piles. They didn't need to destroy the landscape to do it. They could do some very dense stuff, actually. It was cheek by jowl. So to some extent, this is just a question of what people are used to. There's the path dependency around what you know and what you don't know. And that's why I say, I think the practical way to make some use of this report would be to say, look, let's hold a workshop, get everybody in and say, do we have to be doing this everywhere?
One of the other things we thought quite a lot about is how would you change these practices? And one way is to think about regulating your way out of it. But as you point out, that's really difficult. So there's so much variability about it. It might put some cost. There are market forces. Another way is to think about potentially offering incentives for developers to how they provide for their green space to ensure that they've left uncompacted soil and they can get some credits for that, maybe pay less development contributions
that's
or be allowed to build a few extra stories than the plan allows.
Stormwater credits.
Stormwater credits. And equally, you could do that with foundation choice. If they're used to building concrete, but suddenly they realize they're going to get an incentive if they build on piles, they'll start thinking about it.
Yeah.
And the more people do it, the more the construction industry, the developers are all going to get used to it.
And a supplementary to that, and I think you kind of honed in on where I was going next anyway, was, how do we marry that up with efficient development? Because, we have a housing shortage. We need to keep building. The moment the consenting process and the delays in that stage is the biggest thing that holds us back. If it comes down to, disruption of trees, because, there are many properties around where there are trees that have to be pulled down for clearance reasons. And then in the same respect, in terms of doing the screw piles or the rib raft rather than a concrete pad or whatever that is, how we marry that up with the consenting process and getting that through more efficiently so that it isn't a hold up. I think the incenting of it, the incentivization of it is a good thing, but it takes a long time.
One of the interesting things we found in this is that there's multiple consents that you need. You need a building consent, you might need a resource consent, a stormwater consent and a range, and earthworks consents. And developers don't have to do them all, apply for them all at once. The good ones tend to apply for them all at the same time because they realize that the trade-offs that might happen if, oh no, you can't do that earthworks, but it's going to change their stormwater consent, will actually save them time and money. And several councils are providing incentives to do it that way. But when you're doing them separately, that actually adds to the time. And the
A lot of this, I think, is about, getting the big picture right up front before. This is in the greenfield situation. It's much harder in the brownfield, but in the greenfield situation is getting it right before you start. I mean, where I come from, Hamilton City Council requires an integrated catchment management plan to be developed. And so that in the areas around the city where there's wetlands, there's going to be drains, the odd creek and so on and so forth. Before anything starts, there has to be an integrated catchment management plan so you know how you're going to put this all together and make use of the ability of the system to cope with the water. Across the boundary in the next council, they don't do that. They just zone. We're providing housing, housing crisis, zone it. Fine. But what sort of housing is going to be there? Well, we don't know. We'll wait till the developer comes. And the developer turns up. The regional council's got a general consent. And this is the way it works, that they say, here's the council's got a general consent from the regional council. But when the regional council gave that consent, it had no idea what this type of development was going to be. And I think it works so much better from what I can see in Hamilton, because you've got, that's all pre-organised. The regional council has worked with the city. You've got an integrated catchment management plan. It takes a lot of the cost and guesswork out of it. And it means that you make the best use of the stormwater system, the natural stormwater system that you've got. But that's not mandatory. No, that is the thing that you could require councils to do, to actually, if you're going to zone any land, you must first produce an integrated catchment management plan. That would be really helpful, I think.
And just one final little supplementary on that. Do you think there is an advantage to us looking to the hills to encourage stuff like this? Because I think, speaking from someone that's from Hawke's Bay, where we have a huge amount of plains, where concrete pad foundation seems to be the ideal solution because it is flat pad, ready. To then looking at Napier Hill, for example, Bluff Hill, where really that's not that viable in most places. And so they do go straight to piles. And Wellington is a perfect example, and how many, well-established trees are still there. I mean, it seems like it leads quite nicely to that, and avoids also using that fertile class 1, class 2 land. You're into a totally different debate there. I mean, I don't think it's for me to say we should be looking to the hills. I mean, you should be able to build, we know, we did 150 years ago, we could build houses on hills. Dunedin's another case. We can build houses on hills. I mean, whether you want to preserve the flat land, well, then you've got to decide whether you agree with the national policy statement on what is it?
Highly productive.
Highly productive land. Now, I think there's probably a debate amongst you and your colleagues on that one, but that's one way of doing it. I mean,
and it doesn't necessarily avoid all the earthworks.
No.
I mean, we, went, and did a site visit to a site where it was, a very steep side of land, and the way they decided to tackle it was to actually, basically flatten the top of the hillside to kind of get those concrete pads in. And they moved millions of, cubic metres of soil to do so. But, they did also get in negotiation with council, they actually set aside a large area of that catchment to basically native trees. And so they there was a bit of negotiation and balancing there.
This is a little anecdote, that some councils have rules on the maximum gradient you're allowed. So if you're in hilly territory, you have a road, can't be more than 10% or something, or there's a minimum. So you have a hill which is more than that. What do you do if you're the developer? Cut the hill off, and then your road covers within that. It's not actually necessary. You don't have to do that. But I mean, this is what I say. When we went into this, we discovered there wasn't one thing. There's a whole cocktail of regulations and policies and practices which are taking us in a direction. And it really requires, I think it's the Ministry for the Environment's job to say, okay, let's put all of these pieces on the table and see whether we can produce a climate where you don't have to do the flat land and keep searching that out, that you can do stuff. But because the developer will say to you, well, listen, if I've got to cut the top off the hill, I prefer the flat land, thank you. But if you don't have to cut the top off the hill, which is what we didn't do in Brooklyn 100 years ago, then you're fine. I think you'll have, I take it, the Ministry for the Environment in to talk about this. I'd urge you to suggest, to ask them how are they going to actually pick this up with the industry and with councils. because I think it's their job to carry it further. I've put the issue on the table for you, for them. It's for them now to think about.
Mike,
Thank you. I've actually got lots of questions and notes and observations. One of the ones I picked up earlier is just the concerns about the issue around that contamination judgment. You know, the variation, because it feels to me, and I've actually seen it in our region, is some of it's utilised, some of it's, you know, it's the way it's judged and how it's dealt with.
Yes, Bella, you went into this in some detail.
My understanding about the issue, and we've talked a lot to councils and some developers to kind of understand it in depth, as well as we had Manaki Whenua, there's another group that are quite knowledgeable about this. But one of the issues is that a lot of what they call surplus soil is generated, you know, when it's deemed to be contaminated, but it's not allowed to kind of be put back, even if the use that it's going to be put back for is low risk. So I think that's part of the key, the crux of the issue with the NESCS, that I understand that, you know, there's been a lot of work done, and I'd point you towards Manaki Whenua's surplus soils work for details on that.
Right.
Yeah.
I think one of the other things that Bella uncovered is that when a little part of a site is contaminated, developers, it's easier for them to actually just take it all away rather than pay for the multiple tests that would be needed to work out which bits are contaminated and which bits are not.
Yeah, that's another issue, yeah.
And there's variation within regions too, in terms of putting it on farmland and filling up a hollow or something like that. In some places it's easy, so it's actually being utilised, and other places it's very difficult. So again, they just go, oh, we'll go and dump it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, another issue with, sorry, just to complete that, another issue is in the brownfield sites is where there is, if space limitations, potentially movement restrictions also.
Yeah, and I just said some observations here that, you know, there's always that conflict of space versus size in terms of the size of the houses we're building out. 150 square metre house used to be a big house 40, 50 years ago. Now we want to build 300 metre square houses.
Exactly.
And so I'm not quite sure what we do with that. And not many people have an ambition to go upwards and get put in a big holding pen, is how I refer to it. And then we've got our hill versus flat, our highly productive soil wanting to move out in our space. And I've always been concerned about, in terms of our soil in general, that is, and the productivity capacity, whether it's concrete or whether it's a donkey and a llama and such on a lifestyle block, quite often that productive capacity is gone. And I think the fact, or my observation, it happens in little bits and pieces all around the country. And I don't know that we have a very good idea of the total amount that's happening in any given particular year.
I'm sure that's
I
right.
would suspect it's quite alarming if it was all happening in one spot put together.
Yes, well, we do survey land cover in New Zealand, but you'll be thrilled to learn we do it once every 8 years. And it's always putting the hat around to try to see who'll fund it. I mean, it's just another, Mike, you're absolutely right. There's just another case of where we have very poor quality information. I mean, the fact, nobody knew quite what was happening to green space till I did this. I mean, I spent a couple of $100,000 on doing the research to put this together. I'd have thought this is stuff which should be being done by satellite. It should have been done everywhere all the time. So, you have a serious problem with environmental information.
Yes. So pretty much, are you saying we don't know how much land is actually taken up by urban space?
Oh, yes. Well, yeah, we'll know how much, but the change in land use.
Do you know roughly what percentage of soil we are talking about here that is affected by urban?
Not off the top of my head, no. But we have, as I say, there's a land cover database, which has got time series, and that's done by Manaki Whenua, Landcare, and we do it about once every 8 years. Well, a lot happens in 8 years, I can tell you. We do not have a single integrated database of land uses in New Zealand. It's all higgledy-piggledy. There's a real issue to be sorted out there.
But not even a rough. Are we talking about 1%? Are we talking about?
I can't, look, if you want to know the answer, I can, if you'd like to write to me, we can try to find you the answer, but I don't have it off the top of my head.
Sorry, okay, we'll go to
I think
Rachel.
we're out of time.
Okay, a couple of questions. First of all, comment though, glad that Mike is concerned about highly productive soils. Not sure what's wrong with llamas though.
Doesn't know about llamas.
Well,
I don't know.
on the life sentence blocks.
Okay. However, so two questions. One is the incentives conversation we were having before. I was wondering if you thought about organisations like the New Zealand Green Building Council and if it's something that they could factor into
Yes,
their.
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
You'd want them in on that, yeah.
Okay, so
Well-
they can come to the workshop.
One of the things we recommended in the Hotter Cities, and we reference it in this one, is the development of some sort of green score technique
Yeah.
that will score the ability of different green spaces, because there's no one size fits all, there's no one perfect lot of vegetation or green space for a particular area. So you need some system that's able to distinguish and be flexible.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point. And that goes to my second question, which was right at the start of your presentation, you're talking about greener infrastructure and the benefits that
Yeah.
it can have. It can be very cheap. And going back to your last report in our next session is, do you have ideas on how you can cost the benefits of that green infrastructure?
Oh, yeah, I mean, yes, do I have ideas? I don't, that can be done, that is being done. And I think you'll find that Auckland Council, for instance, they can give you the cost benefit analysis on wetland, stormwater reception area and so on and so forth. I mean, that's I think it's,
Is it something that
standard tech.
you'd recommend this committee to be asking about though
Yeah,
as well?
absolutely. No, I mean, that's a key thing, because, you can use green spaces to quite consciously try to, and this has been the case in Auckland during that there were places which were much less effective because of deliberately constructed wetlands to hold that water. There's always trade-offs. I mean, economics is big at the bottom of this. At the end of the day, stuff costs, and you're never going to get away from that. But what I think you can do is at least understand what the difference in cost is. It worth spending more or less or whatever? And also, are there regulations which quite unwittingly are driving people to do things which they don't have to? And that's often the most fruitful thing to look at. That's this geotech, building, regional council regulation stuff. There's a whole thicket of regulations you need to look at.
It's resource management and building issues.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll move to Lan.
Thank you so much. I think most of my questions have been answered, but I just wanted to pick up, I missed the title of that soil, did you say Manaaki Whenua report about the waste
Surplus
soil?
Yeah, they've done some
Surplus
work on surplus soils. So if you just Google Manaaki Whenua surplus soils, it comes up with a report that they've done, which includes recommendations.
Cool, thank you. And so the recommendations are more about like how we actually change the system so that we're not wasting soil, or?
Yes, and it talks about that issue because they held a workshop with something like, and it had very high attendance amongst, consultants, developers, and it had 80 plus, people there. And in that, they actually identified that contaminated land issue as one of a top driver, with the generation of surplus soils. A lot of it's coming from green fields. And yeah, it talks about that particular issue with the contaminated soil, with the NES.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll move to Greg.
Kia ora. Going back quite a way in the conversation, you used the quote, build ready. You know what the driver is for that? Is it simply market or is it regulation driven?
I think it's regulation driven. If it's build ready, the builder, the purchaser doesn't have to go and get a geotech engineer to go and do stuff. It's ready to be built on.
But the geotech engineering could presumably be done for the whole site, which comprises of the various sections, and then it would be build ready for screw
Exactly,
piles?
that's right.
Okay.
Well, no, it could be, yeah, but I'm just saying that if you, for all the reasons that we go into in the report, and Bella's explained that, if you wanted just to take out the soil where the concrete pads are going to go, it's all, it's a mosaic of stuff. It's easy just to go and move the whole thing. That immediately gives you an advantage if you're going down the concrete pad project.
Yeah. And looking at the way MB administers the Building Act, there's a lot of acceptable solutions for concrete pad type houses. So it makes it easy. If it's build ready, they know exactly what type of house they can put on it. You've got a whole bunch of house builders, your Jenny and Homes.
And it's, sometimes to do with the staging, right? So some developments are comprehensive, so the everything's done in one go, and that's a different situation from if you're just developing the land and then you sell on the land. And it's in that second situation that, might be more attractive to have that build ready kind of land.
Yeah. Okay, so potentially my question would be best be answered by the kind of gathering round table that you're suggesting.
I mean, the ministry really, it's really quite simple. Look, we're concerned about the amount of soil that gets stripped and moved. We're concerned about the amount of consolidation of subsoil, which means that we can't, grow things that we might like to grow. What can we do to produce a more soil-friendly urban development environment and have everybody around? And, we all know that there's dollars at stake here, but there's also probably some practical solutions around regulation and around practices and education around practices that can make a difference.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Any last questions? It appears not. Hey, Bella, thank you very much for coming back, and I'm sure Simon's appreciative.
Greatly appreciated, yes.